Hello, I'm Mark Norman, folklore researcher and author, and welcome back to the Folklore Podcast. If you've been following me on social media, you'll know that I've been into hospital for surgery recently. I'm back home, I'm recovering, things are a little bit slow, and there are a number of things that I'm not allowed to do. So, apologies for the sound quality if it's different than usual for this episode. I'm not allowed to carry my microphone to where I would want to be using it, so I'm using alternative means of recording this. And also, I've not had a chance to write or do very much in terms of preparation, but I wanted to get an episode out to you. And so I'm keeping this one a little bit simple in terms of introductions as well. If you've listened to the podcast or watched recently on YouTube, you might have enjoyed our recent mini-series on the Seven Counties Witch Hunt project. One of my guests on that was Professor Marion Gibson from the University of Exeter, or at least until very recently, as Marion is now going freelance. And a little while ago, we recorded an episode with Marion about her book, Witchcraft: A History in 13 Trials. That episode hasn't been released up until now because we were working on other projects with Marion, and so I thought this was perhaps a good opportunity to bring it to you. So that is what this episode is going to be. I hope I made sense. I've been taking an awful lot of tablets to keep my pain down, but do please enjoy this episode.
Yeah, hi, this is Hillary Wilson here, and today I have the pleasure of talking to Marion Gibson. Welcome back to the show after some time of absence.
Hello, Hillary. It's lovely to be back.
Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about Witchcraft, a history in 13 trials with this beautiful cat on the cover. So, can you tell us a little bit about your book?
I can. So it's a 7th century history of witch trials, essentially, which is a big thing. And it starts off with medieval witch trials, which is, I guess, where people might expect it to start. How did they begin? What is demonology, the theory of witches and spirits and devils that assisted in the beginning of witch trials, at least mass witch trials in the Middle Ages. And then it moves forward through the succeeding centuries. I guess it's got most focus on the medieval to 17th century period in the first part of the book, and then the 18th century to the present in the second half of the book. And it ends up right now in the 21st century. So I look at what the word witch means today and what the idea of a witch trial might mean today, wherever that is in the world. And of course, it has different meanings in different places. But I want people to think about really how witch trials are still relevant to us today.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I think people are surprised most about with this book is the fact that so little of the time, is spent within the medieval period.
Mm.
When a person thinks about witch trials, their mind might go immediately to like Monty Python, she turned me into a newt, rather than things that are happening in far more present times.
Yes, I think so. And I wanted the book to challenge that, really, to
Yeah.
help people think about why the Middle Ages is really important in the history of witch hunting, but also talk about why it's been important ever since and how these ideas haven't gone away. So, if you look at much of Western Europe and North America, actually the period of witch hunting is a very long time after the medieval period. So we're looking at the late 16th, mid 17th century, that sort of period. But then as I went on, I started to think more and more about the ways in which, even supposedly in the age of reason that everybody has lived in since the 18th century, there were still witch trials. Some of them concerned real allegations, if you like, of magic and Satanism and so on. Others were more metaphorical. So I talk about the case of a spiritualist medium who was tried under the Witchcraft Act, and I talk about a clergyman accused of Satanism in early 20th century Britain. And then I look more broadly. So I look at indigenous peoples who've been accused of witchcraft. I look at Southern Africa and the really enormous number of cases of witchcraft belief and sometimes formal witchcraft trials that there are there. And then in the final chapter, I come round to modern day North America, so Canada, as well as the United States itself. And I think about the ways in which the word witch is just omnipresent now and what that means for people, particularly when they find themselves in an encounter with the courts or the legal system in some way, and ideas of witchcraft are mixed up in that.
Yeah, it's one of the most fascinating parts of the book is the fact that in some ways the legal process made a bit more sense in the early days.
Mm,
There was a lot of care that was taken within the witch trials. There was, you present cases where witches actually won and, were not, ending up burned to death or, hanged and then put on a pyre. And that was a bit startling because it's kind of rare to see witch trials really examined as legal proceedings.
Good. I wanted that to be a surprise too. And so the first case in the book is one of those. It's one where the accused people, particularly one of them, a woman called Helena Schäuberin, she fights back. And I really loved that. I wanted readers to be surprised and I wanted them to be intrigued and I wanted them to hear her voice, to hear her role in that legal process. And I did want people to think about how, although many of the outcomes of witch trials were absolutely horrific, in
Oh,
some
yes.
cases, people could fight back because there was a formal legal process. It did have certain rules, even though we might not today think that they were all particularly helpful to the accused people. There were rules of evidence, there were rules of process. Things were supposed to happen in particular ways. And it's very often when those processes were abandoned or bent in some way, so that the rules of evidence change, for example, that real
Mhm.
tragedies occurred and a large number of people were found guilty. But the legal processes themselves were often designed, as you say, with some care to
Yeah.
give some opportunity for people to prove their innocence if they could do that.
Yeah, it was interesting to see, how the advent of things like spectral evidence started to play into the legal proceedings and how, credulous people became in regards to it.
It is a massive worry when you look at evidence like that, isn't it? So
Yeah.
Salem is the classic example of spectral evidence, but there are quite a few others across American history. And the case that I talk about in the book is that of Tituba or Tatuba, as I've called her in the book, because I think that's the records tell us that's probably more like what her original name might have been. So I wanted to try and give her that back. But I talk about her and I talk about the idea of spectral evidence in the evidence that she gave and the evidence that people gave against her and others of the Salem accused. And as you look at that, you just become increasingly horrified that people would believe that it was enough to say, oh, I saw the spirit of, goody so and so, and she came and stood at the foot of my bed. And that means that she's a witch. Because at moments like that, of course, the legal process does break down. And that kind of evidence having been accepted, it is impossible for somebody to prove their innocence because there is literally nothing that they can do about that.
I mean, the point that you have 200 some people incarcerated on charges of witchcraft, that there's just not a lot of people left from your town
No, in
in
some
something
cases,
has
there
to be wrong.
absolutely wouldn't have been. They're often pretty small communities, that's one of the
Yeah.
horrifying things. It's very often a really quite small community of people who knew each other quite well, actually, turning on each other, which I think adds to the nastiness of the cases. So I did think it was important to balance that out a bit and have cases where the accused people triumphed in one way or another and where what we might think of as common sense or good legal practice did prevail.
Yeah, with Tadaba, I was really impressed with how much of her biography you were able to put together and how wrong a lot of, commonly perceived ideas of her are.
Mm.
I
Yes,
mean,
yeah, it's something I thought about a lot over the years,
yeah.
because I looked at the case years ago because it's a biggie, isn't it,
Oh,
Salem?
yes, it
It's the
is.
one that everybody knows about. So when I was teaching my classes on witchcraft trials in history at the University of Exeter, where I work in the UK. Of course, I looked at this years ago, and I think a lot of people, and possibly readers of the book, was astonished to discover Tituba was not an African American woman, which is what I thought, based on things like Arthur Miller's play The Crucible, but actually much, much more likely, almost kind of 99.5% certainty as far as we can see, to be a Native American woman, somebody who's referred to as an Indian continually in the original records and never referred to as anything else. So I got more and more interested in that history, and found a great book by Elaine Breslaw, from the 1990s, where she looked at the records in Barbados. She looked at the records of Tituba Tatabe's life, whatever we want to call her, throughout that long and horrifying journey that she went on across the American world, and found out all this stuff about her, which I was then able to deepen further by thinking about the landscape and, where particular plantations were. And that was just a fascinating journey to try and recover as much as possible of who this woman was or might have been. And I wanted to try and give her story a kind of new aspect, a new validity, something that might introduce people to her anew and ask them to think about her differently. So again, I wanted to surprise readers. I wanted them to find something different in that story, because, Salem's a well-told story, but sometimes there are more myths than there are truths in that.
One of the things that it was making me think about, reading about Tataba's story, reading about, some of the cases that you present, in Africa, was the, idea of, and even in the Pennsylvania Dutch country,
Mm.
the idea of these indigenous practices being viewed as witchcraft, and how much gets lost in translation, between these, indigenous practices and then the more Judeo-Christian bureaucracy,
Yes.
essentially. It's something Carl Hoffman went into pretty deeply in his book Savage Harvest, about Michael Rockefeller in Papua New Guinea. And it's, something that it seems we come head to head with again and again
Mhm.
in modern society.
Yes, I think we do. And a lot of the book is concerned with that meeting of cultures and
Yeah.
mutual misunderstanding, which again is a depressing aspect of history that we see over and over again. So I start off, in one of the early chapters of the book, by looking at an indigenous Sami woman, somebody from the Arctic Circle, from the far north of the world, in this case in the Norwegian territories as we now think of them.
Yeah.
And I look at that clash, that she was immediately misperceived as a witch. Whereas if you look at the story with modern eyes, you see somebody who's probably some kind of seer, or claims to have some kind of religious or magical ability related to her own culture, and is forced into confessing that actually this is demonic and actually she is a witch. And of course, then those allegations spread throughout the wider community there. And yeah, we see it happen over and over again. So yes, Salem is one example of that, and there are lots of others too.
Yeah, and one of the interesting through lines as well, with the Sami case of Kari and with the case of Tadaba, the idea that these are people of mixed heritage potentially,
Yes, I think
and
so. People living
that's
between
danger.
cultures. It's a dangerous place for them to be when there's a witch hunt on.
Yeah.
In other times that can be a position of, well, great flexibility and strength, really. But as soon as society turns against you, it's a very dangerous place to be, because they can so easily misrepresent, from both sides, really. They can so easily misrepresent what your beliefs are, what your language is about, who you are as a person, where you belong or don't belong in society. So I wanted to keep looking at that. I wanted to keep throughout the idea of boundaries and liminal spaces and divisions between people and marginalisation at the forefront of the reader's mind, because I think that's absolutely key to understanding why people hold witch trials.
There's this idea within a lot of more indigenous cultures and communities, that those liminal spaces are spaces of power.
Mm.
That if you are someone who cannot easily be categorized, then that's a benefit because that means that you can, in some ways, be anything. You
Yes.
can you can be part of the male part of society and the female part of society. You fit to both spaces, and so therefore you get the benefits of both. Whereas if you're looking at things through a more monotheistic lens, then that means you're dangerous
Mm.
because we
It
can't
does.
categorize you as good or evil.
This is
And
it. The book is all about those
yeah,
binaries. You're absolutely right. And as soon as somebody is perceived to have fallen foul of that binary thinking, and that's asserted as the norm, that's the orthodoxy, there is no dissent from it. That's the moment when such people become vulnerable. And I think you see that happen over and over again throughout the book, whether it's about sexuality or gender or class or race, whatever it's about. It very often, I hope the reader notices this as they go through the book, that's very often where the attention is and where the danger is for the person who's been sucked into this orthodox binary thinking and can't get out of it.
yeah, that was one of the things that really fascinated me about Montague Summers in particular,
Mm.
within the book was his almost chameleon-like ability to exist in so many different places as so many different things, throughout the course of his life, to the point that even now we are still not 100% sure about what was going on with him, which is
No,
kind of
he's a
appropriate.
fascinating figure. It is appropriate, isn't it? He falls through the gaps of history continually. So yeah, he's the clergyman that I was talking about earlier on who gets
Hmm.
accused of Satanism and also gets accused of paedophilia as well. So we're looking at a really, really complex situation of categorization. And it's genuinely uncomfortable to look at it even now. What was he up to? Did he do the things they said he did? Did he not do the things? Did he do some of the things they said he
Yeah.
did? How did this work? And I tried to pick my way through it as carefully as possible and give him back as much as possible of his own story to tell us. But I still think there are questions. You're absolutely right. And in some cases, I think that's true of a lot of the chapters in the book. There are questions still about exactly what did happen, exactly who said what about whom. So often when you look at the records, it appears very cut and dried, and this is what the suspect said, and this is who wrote it down. But then you start thinking about that process of stories being drawn out of people, whether that's very violently by torture or simply by suggestion and pressure and bullying. How much do the people really own their stories when they're telling them? How much do they own their confessions? Who does write them down? What if there are multiple versions, as sometimes there are? Oh my goodness, what do you do with those? And then what do we make of that today? You've also got the longer historical perspective. So something that people might have regarded as a completely open and shut case in, say, the 1640s now appears much more complicated, even in terms of the language that we talk about it. So I do want people to also go away with a little bit of a sense of, well, unease and discovery, and a sense that this isn't a simple history at all. It's still something that we need to think about really, really carefully when we're looking at histories of persecution or examples of persecution in contemporary society. They're not easy. They're not, it's not just, oh, this person is a victim and that person is a villain. It's actually very seldom that way. And I wanted people to think more about that as they went through the book.
One of the things that's interesting about Monty in particular is the fact that he comes across as being very earnest in his beliefs. So when you read his books even now, like when you read his book about werewolves, he's very
Mm,
earnest in his belief that this is something that really exists, and that's something that seems to ring true throughout the people that you quote within who knew him. And he was around fairly recently, all
mm,
things considered. Whereas if you contrast that with the confessions that were drawn out, of the people accused of witchcraft, it's there's belief, but they likely are not 100%, believing what they are saying.
mm.
But you can kind of trace out a lot of their personal history, which is something that you do. That must have been an extremely interesting process for you.
It really was. I love to do that. Yeah,
Yeah.
I love the close reading aspect of looking at historical records and trying to read them to see what you can learn that is verifiable or is against the kind of wider grain of the story that you're being told, which is that this person is a dastardly witch and you know must be punished, must be executed, etc. So I love to do that. And I think you're right. There are a lot of questions about truth and whose truth we're looking at every time you read a story like that, and you have to try and pick your way through it as a reader and decide what you believe might possibly be the case about that person. But I do love to try and assemble a wider collection of records so that we haven't just got the account of the witch trial, we've actually got the widest possible cross section of records about each individual that we talk about, whether that's, records of the manor that they lived on, or, the fields that they owned, or stuff they were accused of by a church court, or whether it's wills or deeds or some other source of information about them is always really helpful. But, there are figures, and Monty is one of them, where even all of that plethora of evidence still doesn't really tell you what was going on, because, as you say, here is a man who believes very determinedly in the real existence of witches, even though he's been the victim of a kind of witch trial. And
Yeah.
perhaps because he's been the victim of a kind of witch trial, who is to say he still, or whatever the right word is, continues to believe in the reality of witches. Not him, of course, but others. And it's always kind of not him, of course, but others, isn't it? And yes, as you say, he believed in witch trials and goblins and devils and all sorts of things. And I believe he was quite sincere in those sentiments. He does seem to be so. And lots of the people throughout the book are. Some of them, as you say, look like they're being coerced and that
Yeah.
they're basically ventriloquizing the fantasies of their questioners, who do indeed believe in these creatures. But in other cases, there seem to be a lot of different magical worlds that people believe in the book, and I did find that quite fascinating to look at.
One of the interesting things that stuck out to me was Monty Reading Everything by Oscar Wilde. And Oscar Wilde had, some interesting ideas, in terms of ecstatic belief as well, with, going back to the, classics, of course, the Greek and Roman literature, which, makes sense given his sexuality, given, him looking for some sort of representation. It could be that Monty seemed drawn to, a lot of these darker things just as a way of getting some kind of representation for people like him.
Yes, I think that makes sense to me. I mean, he's an amazing pioneer. The fact that he's essentially an out gay man in
Yeah,
1908 to 9 in Britain
in the
is,
Catholic Church.
I know, and also a Catholic priest. Yes. How confusing for history. How kind of wonderful. What an amazing individual. And the fact that this all came together and made sense for him is, I think, one of the most fascinating kind of anti-binary thinking examples, if you like, that I can see in the book. And continues to perplex everyone. I've talked about him in class over the years, and I've had every kind of response, from this man is a wicked paedophile, right the way through to this man is a wonderful pioneer. Um, yeah. It's really hard, isn't it? But I think challenging that kind of rigid thinking is really, really important. And it's important as a historian, because it's so easy for historians to kind of come riding in and say, oh yes, I've read the records and this is the truth, this is what happened. And I do think we've got to constantly question that. The book it's one version of all of the stories, and it can't ever be any more than that. I can read as many records as I like, but I'm still not the person who was at the center of these stories, and I still wasn't there. And I want readers to look at them critically and to think about what they think happened. I think it's really important. It's a book that has quite a strong message, because I think that the history of persecution, the ongoing history of persecution, is something we really need to pay attention to and do less of. And that's, if you like, the message of the book. It's about tolerance and acceptance, and the idea that there are not heroes and villains, or victims and villains, in quite the way that history might suggest. So I want people to bear that in mind continually as they go through, but I also want them to make up their own minds. So, if they have a different version of that story, great. So long as they're thinking about matters of persecution and judgment and how we put things and people and ideas on trial, then I think that's probably a good thing.
Which leads us to the binary thinking and how that affected, the people of, the different African countries. Africa has, due to the fact that it has a extremely wide variety of indigenous beliefs, has been viewed as a place where witchcraft never really died out. But you point out that in spite of that commonly pervasive view here in the West, it is a place where witch trials and persecution was resisted until relatively recently.
Yes, it's another surprise, really. It doesn't appear. It's very problematic because there are very few records of early African societies, no matter which part of Africa you look at, but particularly sub-Saharan Africa.
Mhm.
And it was quite difficult to write about, but it does appear that there are relatively few cases of mass witchcraft trials that happen before the interference of Christian missionaries coming into Africa from other places. And I wanted people to think really carefully about that. Was it Christian demonologists, Christian theorists of the devil and witches who imported witchcraft beliefs, at least in the form that they exist today in many African communities, into Africa? Did we take it there, as it were, rather than it existing since prehistory there? And, well, this is just what these people do over there. That came to feel far too simple a reading of what was actually going on. And I wanted people to think about the ways in which, again, those meetings of cultures are really, really
Mhm.
important, and particularly when they lead to misunderstanding, and when one group takes the ideas of another group and run with them, which can just have disastrous consequences when it's an idea like witchcraft, when it's an idea like there are two groups of people and one of them are holy and good and the other one are of the devil and must be persecuted. And that's just such a dangerous idea. And I think in those cases, there are two chapters about Africa, one which is about Lesotho in contemporary South Africa, and the other one which is kind of broader and looks at wider African cultures and the modern representation of witches in things like film and novels and so on. I think it's really important to bear in mind continually how complicated this story is, and just what a dangerous thread there is running through all of these depictions, which has made witch trials more common than they were in the past, rather than the opposite, which is what we would kind of initially, I assume, think was going on.
Yeah, it was absolutely wild to read, and it was incredibly fascinating. The notion of the witch villages was just utterly horrific and crazy to think about that happening now. We
It
think
really
about
is.
witch trials as such an artifact of the past, but
Mm,
I mean, the witch villages was reminding me a lot of the Haitian folklore around the zombies. How the worst thing that could possibly happen to you is to have the essence of your being taken away, be forced to work as a non-person, because of the long shadow that slavery, put over Haiti. And the witch villages were so similar to that.
yes, I think they are. Those are interrelated ideas. And at the
Yeah,
back of that does lie the discourse of enslavement. I think that's
yeah.
absolutely right. And it isn't a coincidence that both those communities are examples of communities that have experienced enslavement. I think that's a really relevant history. And hopefully it does make people think about the kind of wider stories that we tell ourselves about different parts of the world, of different cultures and different races, and how all of this works in culture today.
It was just a really heartening thing to read, just a harrowing is the word I was looking for, harrowing thing to read. And it's something that I feel we don't get exposed to a lot within the
Mm.
West.
No, I don't
Um,
think we do. It felt like a part of the book where I had to learn an awful lot and still felt there was a huge amount more to learn. But it felt like it was an important component of the book because, as you say, it's not talked about that much and not usually in the context of that long history of witch trials. So cases like Salem, again, we feel like, yes, we kind of know about that, even though
yes.
I'd sort of argue that we don't. But you sort of feel like you've got a bit of a handle on what's going on in the European and North American witch trials of the 16th and 17th centuries. But what if there are similar things going on today? And there are. And when you talk to activists and you talk to people who have been through these experiences, you realize that there is this horrifying modern history of witch trials, which absolutely is not over at all.
You actually talk about how Nigeria in particular has a thriving film and television industry, and how they have created all of these pieces of media with dealing with witches,
Mm.
dealing with how to identify witches. And now, thanks to streaming services, that's being spread, and those ideas are starting to spread, so the persecution's starting to spread.
Yes, I think so. It's such a worry, isn't it? But it also makes, I teach both history and literature at my institution, and it made me think over and over again about the role of fiction here. So, we can think about the role of demonology and the way that can be spread, whether that's through early printed books, the revolution of the printing press in the late medieval period, or whether it's through the internet today, or as you say, streaming services. So that there's kind of the factual witch hunting manual, if you like, which is a dangerous type of text to spread around. But then there's also the fiction as well. And we see witches all over contemporary culture. Now, personally, I've experienced that as a good thing because, I've watched things like Charmed and Buffy and, all those great shows of the 1990s that we look back on as moments when the witch really enters into popular culture and does some really interesting things with regard to feminism and so on. But of course, if you live in a different context where people are going to be prone to believe that there really are witches, what do we make of those shows? What do we make of their role in society? What do texts that appear to confirm the existence of witches actually do? Is this the pleasing fantasy of empowerment, or is it something else actually? And again, it's an open-ended question. There's no real fixed answer to this. There's nothing you can point to and say, oh, the truth about this is definitely such and such. But I do want people to think about it. What do those texts mean? What do they mean to readers?
It reminds me of here in North America when the Chilling Adventures of Sabrina
Mm.
came out. There was a huge uproar against it because, this interpreted Sabrina more through the lens of, pulp horror of I would argue more the 70s, where you have her, signing the Black Book of the Devil and the statue of Baphomet and really drawing on that rich fiction history. And oh my goodness, were people worried about this?
Mm.
Worried that it was going to indoctrinate children the same way that like Harry Potter would have indoctrinated children into witchcraft, thinking this is a real thing.
Mm.
It's
It was a
amazing
really
that
bold
fiction
move,
is.
wasn't it? I was
Yeah,
really surprised the way that show went. And you recognize, as you say, you recognize all of these elements, don't you? There's 70s horror, there's Lovecraft, there's Margaret
yes.
Murray. You can see all the fingerprints on it. And you can
Such a
see the
fun
specific.
tapestry.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, just trying to unpick it and see where all the influences have come from is a fascinating, close reading task that people
Yes.
can do. And you can see the 17th century elements that get in there, and you kind of pick, oh yeah, they got that from that trial, and they got that from that trial.
Hmm.
They did their research, all right, didn't they? But I was really surprised. by the boldness of the vision that they brought out of that and the stories that they told. And I think a text like that is a really good example of something that you can see in a very broad variety of ways. Actually, you can look at that as a successor to the kind of bubbly 90s TV show and think, oh, that's great, empowering fantasy. Or you can look at it and think, hang on, this is in some ways very traditional, and has some very disturbing ideas in it. And when you look at how those disturbing ideas play out in certain parts of the world, then actually that's it. Yes, that's actually a really difficult thing to think about.
One of the things that that particular show did that Buffy also was doing to a degree was placing the witch as a figure who is marginalized, the magic, the witchcraft, giving them voice,
Mm.
giving them power. Um, like I think it was the first season of Sabrina, or not yeah, Sabrina was doing that with banned books, digging into banned books. And with, Buffy, you have that with Willow coming to terms with her sexuality. Um, so I think that that's part of the start of, marginalized communities seeing witchcraft as a way to empower themselves, which
Mm.
we see in contemporary American culture with cases like that of Stormy Daniels, which you dig
Yes, I
into.
think so, which I talk about at the end of the
Yeah.
book. And yes, I talked to somebody, I did an interview, it was yesterday, I think, with somebody who was talking about contemporary paganism. And for her, yeah, growing up during that period, she identified those texts as exactly the places where she got the idea that witchcraft was an empowering thing and that she wanted to become a contemporary witch. And she'd also interviewed lots of other people. And, I've spoken to people who have exactly the same experience too, where they think, yeah, this was a moment when they started to identify as witches because they noticed that witches were so often marginal people and they felt like marginal people, and click, there's the identification. And when you look at a figure like Stormy Daniels, I didn't know she was a pagan until I started looking at her case. I was attracted to it initially by noticing how many times Donald Trump used the word witch in capital letters with exclamation marks. I mean, who wouldn't notice that as a witchcraft historian? So I started looking at that. But then I discovered that actually his adversary, Stormy Daniels, identifies as a witch, as a Wiccan, has been honoured by the community of witches at Salem, actually describes herself in very straightforward terms as a tarot reader, as somebody who's interested in the paranormal, believes she has magical powers of various kinds. What a fascinating figure. So turned the chapter around and made it about her rather than about him, because I wanted
Yeah.
to think about the ways in which she sees herself as a marginalized figure, and for her, the position of witch is actually a really powerful one. So it doesn't matter what people call her. It doesn't matter what people think of her. It doesn't matter how much they throw around words like witch. She's really happy to embrace them. And I think lots of contemporary pagans would say the same thing.
There's Lisa Kroger in her book Toil and Trouble, which is a history of um, witches throughout time and females within female identifying people, within the occultic world. She talks about Stormy Daniels starting a ghost hunting team that was an all-female ghost hunting team, and how little you see things like that within, occult spaces.
Mm.
So she was really revolutionizing a lot of the ghost hunting and paranormal scene by doing this sort of thing,
Yes.
which was fascinating to me. Her embrace of the title and the way that she, presents and carries herself, with all the
Yes.
accusations upon her.
Yes. Yeah. I found the more I thought about her, the more I thought about what a radical figure she is and how threatening she is, therefore, to certain types of establishment figure. And just how interesting all of that is when you frame it within the frame of the witch trial and you look back at figures like Helena Schäuble and you think, oh, yes, actually, these people are really quite similar. I'd be
A good through
fascinated to
line.
know what she thinks of it. But I saw her in those previous generations of women who'd also done really surprising things with their lives. And as you say, people of all kinds who had done really surprising things with their lives. People like Monty Summers. I thought she actually belonged to this really long tradition. And I didn't expect the book to go that way. I didn't expect to see that at the end of the book or to end up in quite that place. But that was where the historical type, that kind of historical person seemed to lead. So I went there. And again, that felt quite risky. A lot of this book, I'm just a historian of the past. I write about the 16th and 17th centuries, and occasionally I might, move forward a little bit and then move back a little bit into the medieval period. But I didn't really expect to find myself writing about such recent figures. And I didn't expect this to become more and more relevant. I mean, I think like a lot of people, I think over the past 10 years or so, these ideas have become worryingly present in our society, as well as present in ways that are more, more fun, more acceptable to us. And I thought her story was a really good example of something I wouldn't have expected to write, wouldn't have written 10 years ago, but really kind of felt I had to write now.
I mean, one of the things that I found most interesting, through the pandemic and to modern times, and we're talking about this a little before we started recording, is the, rise of pagan belief and people identifying as witches or people wanting to identify as witches, which all you have to do is say you're a witch. But, people wanting to practice these things. And it seems to, in my opinion, be arising from, these places or these spaces being places where people of all different backgrounds can come together. Being more inclusive, being a way to give a voice to people who really don't have much of a voice or feel like they don't have a voice right now.
Yes, and I
Um,
think that picks up on the theme of the book really, which is that
yeah,
there are all sorts of ways that people might end up in the category witch, but marginalization is clearly one of them, and different
yes.
types of marginalization. That I even put a list in at the end of the book, as you'll have noticed, a kind of
Mhm.
checklist. Do you or does somebody fit into any of these categories? If so, they might very well have become a victim of a witch trial, either in the past or today. Shall we think a bit more about this, and why we continue to frame people in this way? Because I do think it's really important.
And it's, there are a lot of interesting things, shall we say, happening right now, with media increasingly getting seized away from the people, with people having fewer and fewer ways to really communicate freely, which seems like a recipe for more and more witchcraft, more and more smaller communities.
Yeah, yeah.
Which is ironic since that's something that's trying to be stamped out.
Yes, I think the idea of the witch is super relevant, not only because we hear about it all the time in the media, and people are now starting in societies where you wouldn't once have imagined that would happen to make real life witchcraft allegations. But the flip side of that, as you say, is that more and more people are identifying themselves as being witchy in some way and finding that really empowering and building their own communities, building their own circles, if you like, whereby they can explore those identities. It feels like a really rich time to be studying the history of witchcraft because it becomes more and more relevant almost every day at the moment.
Yeah.
And I find that quite fascinating. That really isn't something I expect. I've been doing this for about 25 years now. I've been interested in witches for about 25 years. And I got interested by reading a story of an Elizabethan witch trial, which I wrote another book about. And I really wanted to recover the voices of the accused women in that. And it was really no more than that desire, look at historical documents, trying to find out as much as possible about the historical individuals. But because the way culture has moved and because the way history's moved during our lifetimes, this antiquarian interest, if you like, has now become a really relevant topical one. And I would not have predicted that. If you'd said to me 25 years ago, politicians will be throwing the word witch around, and, what you say about witches will be quite controversial in some circles,
Yes.
I'd have said, are you mad? No, of course that's not going to happen. But it did, didn't it?
What do you think is the recipe to step away from the type of binary thinking that results in things like witch trials. Do you think there is one?
Oh, I know. I thought throughout the course of the book, is there a way to escape from this trap of human thinking, of culture? And I don't really think there is. And I didn't really want to come to that conclusion. Maybe it's just because I'm old and tired. I don't know. I would like to have come to a conclusion that all this, thriving, swirling discourse can be pushed and taken in directions that are more empowering and freeing. But I guess if you're writing a book about witch trials, you're probably going to end up thinking something a bit different. And the something that I ended up thinking was this seems to be hardwired into the way that people think. We seem to have this ghastly desire to create enemies within our societies or outside of our societies as we think of it, them and us, the outsiders and us. Um, and you just see it over and over again. And the more I look at it, I'm writing at the moment about the British Civil Wars and the Witchfinder General trials. And you look at this, you look at the world of the mid 17th century, and you see so many parallels with today. And what are they doing? They're embarking on a massive witch hunt.
Yeah.
Oh dear. So I suppose I have quite a pessimistic outcome to that question, really, quite a pessimistic answer. I'm always thrilled when somebody has something more optimistic to say, and that is what I would like to see. I would
I
like
mean,
to see this as a history of resistance as well as a history of persecution, if you like.
I think it's fair to view it that way. Because I mean, if you look at Matthew Hopkins, the Witchfinder General, he was really quite a pitiful figure.
Mm. He was, he was
Just
so
a
young. Yeah,
yeah, a sad man. He lived to be
yes.
27, I believe.
Something like
And
that. We're not entirely sure, but it looks like mid-20s. Yeah.
yeah,
And that is
it's just
fascinating.
sad.
It is sad. It is. And although he's clearly villainous in many different ways, at the same time, he is also not a villain. He's not the Vincent Price, hammer villain that
No, he
some
didn't
people would
deserve
have
Vincent
him as
Price.
be. Does anyone deserve Vincent Price? Um, and
But
yeah, I found him difficult to write about in many ways because I do feel sorry for him. At the same time, he reminds me really powerfully of young male figures in our own society who have these very, very harsh and orthodox ideas about issues like, gender roles and political parties and ways of
I
thinking
mean,
about the world. And he
you,
looks just like one of those.
you said it in the book, and I was really struck by how apt this description was. But figures like Matthew Hopkins, like Heinrich Kramer, who wrote the Hammer of the Witches, they have a lot in common, belief-wise and just life trajectory-wise, to people like the members of the incel community.
Yes, I did think
And
there was a strong parallel there. Yes.
it's an incredibly strong parallel, and it's something that you highlighted extremely well, talking about how misogynistic a lot of these texts were, how they were being written by people who, to a large degree, had no idea what they were writing about.
Mm.
And it, thinking about, that and thinking about parallels to modern day, it gave me a little bit of hope because I was thinking about that in comparison with figures like Frederick Brennan, who was the founder of 8kun online and a large voice in the incel community, who not only got out of it, but became a huge voice of resistance, by getting out of it. And how he got out of it was just finding somebody who actually listened to him and was like,
Mm.
no, no, no,
Mm.
you are a
Yes.
silly man, for this. And, a lot of times, a lot of this hatred and fear, seems to come from just being so isolated.
Mm. Yes, I wonder if somebody had sat down with Matthew Hopkins and turned him away from the ideas that
Yeah.
he had. And, I think he was a frightened person. He was frightened of the idea that witches were outside his house in the night. He was
Mhm.
frightened of I think he was frightened of women, as you talked about.
Oh, definitely.
Um, it's really noticeable that a very, very high proportion of the suspects he accuses are women, to the extent that sometimes it's 100%, which is actually quite rare. It's something like
Yeah.
80 to 75% is much more common, which is clearly misogynistic in its impulse, but it's not 100%. Whereas for him, it was quite often 100% of the people were female. And I think that does matter. And I think if somebody other than John Stern had sat down with him and talked through his ideas, maybe this would have gone differently because he was so very young. I feel like he embarked on this moral crusade because, as you say, he really did not know what he was doing. He'd read a couple of demonologies, he thought he
Yeah.
knew stuff, but clearly, demonstrably, he did not know stuff. And he was still experimenting as he went through this horrific series of persecutions. Um, to the extent he was trying out different methods of interrogation, and he was trying out different tests to see whether, by throwing people into water, was this a good test or not? And, he decides ultimately with the aid of other people, no, this is not a good test. This isn't theologically sound. He's thrashing around, he's flailing around in a culture which has encouraged him to be misogynistic and persecutory. And yeah, maybe what he wanted was answers as to, I mean, he appears to have been very ill. Certainly his brother died of something which killed him again in his early 20s, and people have speculated that might have been some form of consumption or tuberculosis or something like that. I suspect he was a really sick young man, which is why he died so young. Maybe he just wanted answers as to why this had happened to him.
Yeah.
We don't know, but it's one way to look at the story, isn't it? And think about why somebody makes those kind of allegations against other people when they don't have to, but society is pushing them towards that.
And like so soon after his death, people were just mocking him relentlessly too. People weren't
Yes.
taking him seriously in spite of all of the damage that he did, which was only like 3 years or so that he was even active,
Yes, it
which
was a
is
really short period of time. Yeah,
yeah, it's
absolutely.
wild to think about, the
It
amount of
is.
damage he did
It is.
in
It
such
is
a short
astonishing
time.
and horrifying, isn't it? But you're right, he did inspire a lot of resistance, particularly towards the end of that period. People started to write against him. They started to take action. More people started to get acquitted. So the courts actually came back to something more like their traditional posture with regard to witchcraft, which was, yes, you can be acquitted, actually, and you can be freed, and this is fine. So yes, it's a brief, terrible outbreak, and I think it illustrates quite nicely what we were talking about earlier, that it's possible to read this very negatively and see this as a deeply damaged individual who's just acting out the fantasies that society has put into his head. But on the other hand, you can also see it as a moment when people do resist this binary thinking and this persecutory thinking and the idea of the witch trial and stand up against it. So yeah, there's a Matthew Hopkins chapter in the book, but again, I tried not to make it about him. I've tried to make it
Yeah.
instead about Elizabeth Clark, who was one of the first people he accused, and tell her story. And I found some new records about her as well. So that was really gratifying. So I've
Yeah.
tried again to turn things around from what readers might expect and show them something different that maybe gets them to think a bit more about what's going on in that whole story.
I, I found as, depressing as the topic is, I did find a lot of hope within all of this because there were so many people, who were resisting. Like seeing Hopkins reframed through the lens that people really saw him during the time, which was much more the sad, weird young guy as opposed to the amazing Vincent Price. Seeing people start to reclaim the title of witch, seeing people like Nellie Duncan, who were able to really make a living for themselves, through what they were doing. It's incredibly inspiring, especially with people now claiming and owning the title today.
Mm.
You know,
Yes,
it
Nellie's a very inspiring figure, isn't she?
Nellie
She's
was
a working
amazing.
class Scottish woman, factory worker, teenage mother, and somebody who, although she has many trials and tribulations during her life, and it's not an easy life, just seems so resilient and so resistant to being framed and shoved into a box or jailed, and all of the horrible things that happened to her. Yeah, and I do continue to find her story quite inspiring. Again, it's a story of many open questions. People can decide for themselves what they think was going on in her life. But I think you can't really come away from it with anything other than a kind of appreciation and excitement about just her sheer liveliness as a person.
She's
And
amazing.
she's amazing. So many of these people are amazing people.
Yeah, I mean, her standing up like in the middle of the trial to just say, no, this is
Yes.
real, I did this. Like, she's a wonderful figure, and she's easy to relate to as well, with her finally getting some money and just buying a nice fur coat for herself.
Yeah. Buys
Like,
herself a nice house, buys
what a
herself a
woman.
fur
Yeah.
coat. Yeah.
I mean, she was literally supporting her husband and all of her kids,
Yes.
her insane number of children.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, the poverty with which she was living in was just terrible to consider. And the fact that so many people were going through that,
Yes.
and then look how she made it. Like,
Yes. And she was
she was
far
doing
from
her
unique.
best.
She's a particularly successful example of a
Yeah.
spiritualist medium. But there were lots and lots of people, and still are lots and lots of people for whom this is a church, a faith, a way of life. And I think even though she thought of herself as resolutely, firmly Christian, I think it's important to say that. At the same time, she does fit really nicely into that kind of wider bracket of people that we've been talking about who find religious resistance in the idea of witchcraft.
Yeah, spiritualism in and of itself was very much aligned with that. Here in the US, spiritualists were also aligned with you know, ab the abolition of slavery, the equal rights for women. It was one of the only ways that women could really make a career for themselves was within, that line, and the failure of spiritualism, as a faith, which many people view it as being a failure, was not really due to lack of interest, but due to the fact that they kind of got everything they wanted.
Mm,
Women got the vote,
mm,
women were able to, work in jobs that they wanted to. The fact that spiritualism has, to a degree, been on the rise, I think, is also a sign that, you know, maybe things are regressing a little bit.
mm. I think so. I do think where people have very little power in the material world around them, often ideas of magic come up because magic does offer that opportunity to empower yourself, doesn't it? If you can believe it to be real, or you can invest in the culture that believes it to be real, then it can actually offer you an awful lot. And it can offer you ways of thinking about yourself that are new and different and empowering. And as we've been talking about with Nellie, quite often it offers really good opportunities for your own voice to be heard, for commercial opportunities, for building a life and a career where maybe one wouldn't otherwise be open to you. And I think those are all really important things. If you think about a witch trial as a persecution, but one which also allows the accused person to be heard, then suddenly you've got a different way of looking at it. And I think that is very relevant today.
And I think that that's also something that's been interesting to read within your book. The people who realized that this was an opportunity to be heard,
Yes.
being on trial, and how powerfully they used that.
They did. And sometimes it went horribly wrong and they, were executed as a result of it.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, they did tell a story about themselves, and they told a story about their lives. And in other cases, it was spectacularly successful. And that story has endured well beyond the kind of legacy of the trial to which they were subjected. And in some cases, we can retell that story anew for the first time because something new has come to light about them, which is always particularly exciting. We found a new record, we found a new way of interpreting this person. That's just fascinating. It feels like their time has come when you get to tell that story, which is their story, but maybe not one that was during their lifetime heard in the way they would have wanted.
Yeah, what was the record you were most excited to uncover? Because you did uncover a lot of new information in writing this book.
I did, gosh, I think there's a lot to choose from. Um, I think probably it was quite a simple one about Bess Clark, the woman who was questioned and drawn into the witch trial of Matthew Hopkins.
Mhm.
And she's always been portrayed as this very elderly woman. People have, if you look at texts about her, people say, oh, she was 80. I don't know where they got this idea from, but 80 seems to have really stuck. Oh, she was an older woman, blah, blah. And then when you look at the parish records about her, you realise she's quite a young woman because 3 years before the trial, she has a child. So clearly not 80 or anything like it. And I think
Yeah.
that was a really powerful moment. I'd done things like that before in researching witchcraft trials, including that one in Essex that I read all those years ago. I've done that before and found something really surprisingly new about a historical individual that we thought we knew really well. But that was a real kicker. I was really excited about that. And seeing her as a young mother made it look completely different than seeing her as an older woman. You can't really tell that story about the old woman who lives on the edge of the village and, is discarded by her community and is useless and postmenopausal and all those things that historians tend to say about witches. You can't tell that story. You've got to tell instead a story about a young woman who has an illegitimate child. She's disabled. She's still unmarried by the time that she's put on trial. She has this whole family. I found a record of her family.
Yeah.
And that's a completely different person, surely. How interesting. How interesting. And I'm going back to that series of trials again to see what else I can find there. Because every time I look, there is something that is surprising and new. And it's amazing, really, how much historical record there is of people involved in witch trials. There's so much to discover. I sometimes talk in interviews about I kind of, get thumping the table and start saying to people, go and look in your local archive because you never know. You never know what might be there. It could be anything. Maybe you live in an area where there was a famous witch trial. If so, go and look at the records for yourself. Go and make up your own story about it. Make up your own mind about what happened there. If you live in an area where maybe you don't think there were witch trials, go and look anyway and look in later times, see if there's anything in the local press that is actually, well, that's about witches, actually. That's about witchcraft belief. That's about magic. How interesting. Because I do think the world is still full of archives about witch trials, which is
Oh,
great.
gods, yes. There was I think it was in the 80s here, where I live, the local college had a bit of a witch panic attached to it. And there was a whole case where people had made up this witch cult at the University of Maryland, and it was a prank. But they started like publishing accounts of it in the paper there, and it got more and more absurd. They were just creating the craziest things. But the kicker is that this black magic was completely fake. But there was a weird shack down the road from the university where they found a ton of beheaded cats and lots of other animal sacrifices that they still don't know what that was all about.
That's fascinating. There you see
And yeah, nobody's
that.
dug into that history either.
Yeah, that
And
story or stories like it. Yeah.
yeah,
And again, we've got that very problematic relationship between ideas of evidence and truth and history
hmm
and fabrication of fiction and lies. That's really interesting.
yeah, it's a really weird case, and not a lot of people have gone into it. I've been trying to dig through the newspaper archives, to see what I can find since it was so recent.
Mm.
Um,
There's
but
always something new to learn, and that sounds like a story that people need to know
yeah,
about.
that's right there in the University of Maryland. So there's no excuse for people in North America to not dig into their own past here too.
No,
There's weird stuff
exactly.
everywhere.
Yeah, go do it. Feel empowered to do it. Even if you can't read old handwriting, learn. I wasn't born knowing how to do this. Learn, read stuff. Yeah, go and dig into the archives, demand access to the archives, support the
And
archives.
if
Do
you
it.
can read old handwriting, The National Archives here in the US are looking for people to transcribe a lot of the old letters because there is a scarcity of people who can read cursive. But you know what? You can learn to read cursive. It's not that difficult. So they're looking for volunteers, and I'm sure there's places out near you as well who are doing the same.
Yes. Yeah. Support your local archive. It's a good message, isn't it? Yeah. Go and get
Sure
involved and see
is.
what you can find.
Yeah, so I have to ask, what are you working on currently, and where can people find you online to follow your work?
Yeah, this is so what I'm working on at the moment is the book about the Witchfinder General trials that we
Mhm.
were talking about earlier. So that will be submitted, haha, hopefully, in September
Well,
2025. And that will
I'm look.
come out in Britain and the Commonwealth and North America. So this is good. If you want to find me, I'm on Instagram at witches etc. So etc witches etc Insta. And I'm also on Blue Sky with a very similar name, but fairly recent. And you can find me
Excellent.
there too. And yeah, I guess I'm on LinkedIn and various other places. I have a website. So do come and look for me. And if you have interesting stories to tell and you want to know more about witch trials, then this is the place to be.
Well, thank you very much for your time. It's been a great pleasure to get to chat with you.
Oh, it's been fun. Thank you. You've asked great questions too. Always fun
Thank
to
you.
talk about witches.
It is always fun and always relevant.
My thanks to Marion for recording that episode of the podcast, which I'm delighted to finally be able to bring to you. And my thanks to you for bearing with me whilst I recover from my surgery. Hopefully, normal service will be resumed very soon, but in the meantime, I will do my level best to bring you as much content as I can.